What if everything you believe about the meaning of life is just a necessary lie? What if the freedom we value so much is actually our greatest prison? Existentialist philosophy dared to touch the deepest wounds of the human condition: absurdity, emptiness, loneliness, freedom, and death. In this video, we're diving into forbidden ideas, thoughts most people avoid, but that can change the way we see existence. Get ready to question everything, even the very act of existing. There's a question that quietly haunts all of us. Is life worth living? For Albert Camus, this is the only truly serious philosophical question. In the myth of Sisyphus, he starts by saying something most wouldn't dare to admit. Suicide, above all, is a response to the absurdity of existence. Camus isn't encouraging suicide, but he refuses to stay silent about the question. He wants to look that anguish in the eye. To him, suicide emerges as an extreme attempt to escape the absurd, that conflict between our human hunger for meaning and the cold, indifferent silence of the universe. When the world offers no answers, suicide seems like a radical escape. Perhaps the only decision that isn't imposed by culture, religion, fear, or tradition. That's why Camus asks, is this the only truly free choice? Most of our decisions are shaped by outside forces, but choosing to live or die escapes all those pressures. It's total. It's the moment where we face the ultimate limit of freedom. But here's the key. Camus says that recognizing the absurd doesn't mean surrendering to despair. In fact, he calls for a rebellion, not a violent one, but an inner revolt. A choice to say yes to life, even when it has no guaranteed meaning. Sisyphus, the mythological figure condemned to push a boulder up a hill for eternity, symbolizes our human condition. He's stuck in a pointless, endless task, just like us, trying to create meaning where none is guaranteed. But Camus ends with a stunning line. We must imagine Sisyphus happy. Happy? Yes, because Sisyphus becomes aware of his fate, and by accepting it without illusion, he rises above it. He doesn't give in. He defies it. And this act of continuing, even in the face of the void, is the ultimate expression of freedom. So, suicide isn't the only truly free choice. It is a choice. But Camus shows us that living absurdly, living without guarantees, is also a form of freedom. A harder one, a braver one, a more creative one. The real question might not be, is life worth living? But rather, how do we live knowing there's no pre-made meaning? And Camus' answer is clear, with rebellion, with clarity, and with joy that asks for no illusions. There are moments when reason fails, when no logical argument can carry the weight of being. In that abyss, between what we understand and what we are, Søren Kierkegaard offers a radical proposal, the leap of faith. But is that leap liberation or self-deception? Is it courage or cowardice? Is faith a leap or a way to run away? In The Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard digs into the heart of existence and finds a paradox. We are a mix of the finite and the infinite, of necessity and freedom. And this paradox leaves us exposed to a silent kind of pain, despair. But here, despair isn't just sadness, it's something deeper, a disconnection from our true selves, a refusal to be what we truly are. Kierkegaard describes many forms of despair. Some people avoid themselves by living shallow lives, chasing vanity, pleasure, or routine. Others are aware of their pain, but turn it into hatred, guilt, or nihilism. To him, despair is the most common state of the human condition, and yet few are brave enough to admit it. Faith enters this space not as cheap comfort, but as confrontation. True faith, according to Kierkegaard, demands a break from reason, the world, and even logic. It's what he calls a leap, an existential act where you embrace the paradox of your existence and throw yourself, with no guarantees, into the arms of God. But pay attention, this isn't religious faith in the traditional sense. It's not about formulas, dogma, or spiritual comfort. For Kierkegaard, faith is a personal drama. It means facing despair without masks. It's not running from pain, it's walking through it until you find a unique, unshakable meaning. The leap of faith isn't irrational, it's beyond reason. It's like Abraham climbing the mountain to sacrifice Isaac. Ethically, it makes no sense. But in the silence of existence, it becomes the purest act of radical trust. Faith begins where all certainties end. So, is it an escape? If it's used to avoid anguish, yes. If it's a shelter to avoid facing despair, then it becomes illusion. But if it's an act of confrontation, of accepting our limits, then faith is the bravest leap of all. Kierkegaard says, the greatest danger, the one that leads to ruin, is not to despair. Ultimately, faith doesn't solve the paradox. It lives inside it. It doesn't close the abyss. It teaches you to walk across it. Real faith might not pull us away from anguish. It teaches us to endure it, while holding on to our desire to be whole, despite everything. Freedom, a word we desire, celebrate, and hold up as a supreme value. But what if total freedom isn't a blessing, but an unbearable burden? Jean-Paul Sartre, in Being and Nothingness, makes a shocking claim. We are absolutely free, and that freedom is our curse. Yes, condemned to be free is how he puts it. Because for Sartre, there is no fixed essence, no set human nature, no identity we're born with. We're thrown into the world, and from that point on, we must create ourselves. That might sound empowering, but Sartre takes it further. Radical freedom makes us totally responsible for everything we do, and even for what we choose not to do. We can't hide behind God, biology, culture, or circumstance. If you lie, it's because you chose to. If you follow a social norm, you accepted it. If you live in conformity, that too was your decision. Sartre says, man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. There are no excuses, and that's where freedom begins to feel like a curse. This unlimited freedom creates a state he calls anguish, not fear of failure, but fear of infinite possibilities. You can be anything, and that's terrifying, because every choice means giving up all others. To choose is to lose, and you alone are responsible for that loss. So how do we cope with this? We often run. Sartre calls this bad faith, when we pretend we aren't free, when we act as if we're just roles, jobs, or functions. We say, it's not my choice, it's society, it's my family, it's life. But that's a comfortable lie. Bad faith is a way to avoid the weight of freedom. So yes, radical freedom can feel like a curse, because it strips us bare. It removes the safety of being something defined. Sartre says human consciousness is a nothingness, an open space between what we are and what we could become. And that emptiness is what lets us shape ourselves, but also what throws us into the dizzying depth of choice. The real question isn't, is radical freedom a curse? It's, do we have the courage to live it honestly? Because only when we accept that full freedom, without masks, can we become truly authentic. To be free is to carry the weight of your own existence, and never hand that responsibility to anyone else. As Sartre says, at every moment, man is inventing man. That's beautiful and terrifying, but it might just be the price of being real. Émile Cioran offers no comfort. He's not interested in meaning, redemption, or hope. What he brings, in The Trouble with Being Born, is a sharp and unfiltered clarity. Maybe existence isn't a gift, but a mistake, a cosmic accident. For Cioran, the very fact that we're born is a silent tragedy. Consciousness, that spark many philosophers praise, he sees as a curse, because only humans are fully aware of their own finitude, of the absurd, of the pain of time. Only humans carry within them the knowledge of the void. He writes, "To be is to be guilty. Only the dead are innocent." This isn't cheap nihilism or a pessimistic performance. It runs deeper. Sioran looks at the world and sees that everything alive is doomed to suffer, wither, and vanish. And yet we keep searching for meaning, as if the universe had something to say to us. But to him, the universe stays silent. There is no plan, no destiny, no redemption, only the noise of decay. So the question arises, is existence a cosmic mistake? For Sioran, yes, and that mistake is called consciousness. Before we could think, before guilt or the desire for eternity, we were simply nature. But now, as conscious beings, we live in a constant state of uprootedness. We're animals who know too much to live peacefully, and too little to find any ultimate meaning. There's a strange kind of poetry in his despair. He writes like a prophet of disillusionment. To him, the kind of philosophy that chases foundations or systems is ridiculous. It ignores the inner scream of those who suffer just from being alive. Sioran says, to be born is to begin to die, and to live is to prolong this mistake for as long as possible, carrying an identity we didn't choose and a body that's constantly falling apart. But, and this is essential, Sioran isn't purely dark. There's a kind of dark humor in his writing, almost freeing. If nothing makes sense, then everything is allowed, not in a moral sense, but in a lucid one. If there's no final purpose, then we can laugh at the absurd, enjoy the emptiness, and find irony in the drama of being. It's like he's saying, if existence is a mistake, at least let it be an aesthetically interesting one. In that sense, his view isn't cowardly, it's brutally honest. Instead of hiding in metaphysical illusions or religious hopes, Sioran stares into the abyss and writes from it with terrifying clarity. Maybe what he's teaching us isn't to give up on life, but to stop demanding from life what it can't give. Existence doesn't need meaning to be bearable. It just needs to be seen without illusions. And that, as paradoxical as it sounds, might be a very real kind of freedom. Friedrich Nietzsche doesn't ask what is good or evil. He asks who decided what's good or evil and why. In Beyond Good and Evil, he's not just challenging traditional morality, he's deconstructing its origins. To him, the creation of values isn't objective, rational, or divine. It's historical, psychological, and political. And here comes the question, is the creation of values always arbitrary? Nietzsche begins by attacking the idea of universal, absolute values. He argues that traditional morality, especially Judeo-Christian morality, was born from the resentment of the weak against the strong. What we now call virtue was often just a defense mechanism. Kindness, humility, obedience, these weren't eternal truths, but tools used by those in weaker positions to survive. He calls this the morality of the slaves, a way of thinking that denies life, represses instincts, and turns strength into sin. In contrast, there once was an aristocratic morality, one that celebrated life, power, pride, and excellence. But over time, this was suppressed and turned into guilt and self-punishment. So yes, for Nietzsche, values don't come from above or from pure reason. They're always expressions of the will. That's why he talks about the will to power, a creative force behind culture, morality, even knowledge. To create values is to impose a worldview, and that process is never neutral. But does that mean all values are equally valid, that everything's relative? Nietzsche doesn't fall into passive nihilism. He's not saying values are meaningless, quite the opposite. Because they are human, values should be consciously recreated, not blindly inherited. That's why he praises the free spirit, the one who questions, dismantles, and dares to build new paths. The problem isn't that values change, it's when we accept them without thinking. The real mistake is blind obedience. The issue isn't that values are constructed, it's pretending they're not. Nietzsche proposes a new morality, not based on denial but affirmation, an ethic of strength, creativity, and joy. But this new morality won't be universal. Every strong individual must be their own lawgiver. As he writes, become who you are. So yes, the creation of values is human, changeable, and powerful. It's not about accepting just anything, but understanding that all morality is a choice, and every choice has consequences. The real question isn't if values are arbitrary, it's, do you have the courage to create your own? The human being is, by definition, incomplete. We live aware of our limitations, our finiteness, and the fact that we'll never be fully understood, not even by ourselves. This fundamental loneliness, which Simone de Beauvoir calls ontological loneliness, is an unavoidable part of being a conscious, free subject. And in the face of this, love often appears as a promise of transcendence. The hope that by uniting with another, we can somehow step outside ourselves and touch, even briefly, a sense of wholeness. But is love just a way of escaping our solitude? In The Second Sex, Beauvoir explores love, especially for women, within both social and existential structures. She observes that women have historically been taught to seek meaning in the other, especially in men. Love wasn't presented as a choice, but as a life mission. But her critique goes beyond gender. Romantic love, as it's often idealized, carries a dangerous illusion: the belief that we can merge with another, dissolve our freedom, and escape our existential pain. And here's the key: the desire to love can absolutely be a way of avoiding ontological loneliness. But that escape comes at a high cost. When we make love about being everything for someone else, or being saved by them, we fall into bad faith. We lose our autonomy, betray our freedom, and ironically, become even more alone because we've stopped being subjects and become projections. Beauvoir offers a different vision of love, one between two free beings, a love where both recognize the other's separateness, their independence, their own solitude. This kind of love isn't about fusion, it's about coexistence. It doesn't save us, but it walks beside us. She writes, "To love authentically is to want the other's freedom as much as your own." That line is everything. It shows that real love doesn't erase loneliness, it makes it bearable. It doesn't take us out of the human condition. It offers us company inside it. So yes, love can be a way to forget ontological loneliness, but when used that way, it becomes dependency, a denial of the self. On the other hand, when lived with clarity and freedom, love becomes an act of courage, a meeting between two beings who know they'll never be one, but choose to walk together anyway. Ontological loneliness has no cure. But love, if not used as an escape, might just be the most beautiful response. We live as if we were eternal. We fill our days with goals, distractions, and routines, while avoiding the one certainty we've carried since birth: death. For Martin Heidegger, in Being and Time, this avoidance isn't just cultural, it's existential. Most of everyday life, he says, is lived in inauthenticity, in a way of being that avoids facing what we truly are, beings toward death. But what does that mean? Heidegger says death isn't just a biological event that happens at the end. Death is the most radical and personal possibility of Dasein, his term for human existence as conscious being in the world. Death is the possibility of impossibility, the end of all possibilities, and it's always present, even when we ignore it. To live authentically for Heidegger is to acknowledge this truth, not in a morbid way, but as a call to clarity. When we fully realize that we are finite, we start to live differently. We begin making choices that are truly ours, not just copies of what they do or expect. That's why Heidegger says death is the only truly authentic truth, because it can't be delegated, delayed, or experienced by anyone else. Only I can die my death, and that's what makes it fully mine. All other truths, social, religious, cultural, can be shared, debated, or imposed. But death is non-transferable. It's the one truth that belongs to each of us completely. Death breaks the anonymity of everyday existence. It pulls us out of the fog and forces us to ask, am I living as myself or just playing roles? Paradoxically, death doesn't call us to give up, but to wake up. It doesn't lead to despair, it leads to responsibility. Heidegger distinguishes two ways of being with death: the inauthentic, putting it off, minimizing it, hiding from it; the authentic, embracing it as part of existence. And this embrace doesn't paralyze us, it frees us, because in facing the end, we gain clarity about the now. Each moment becomes precious, each choice becomes real. So death isn't just a limit, it's a source of meaning. It's the horizon that gives life its urgency and uniqueness. As Heidegger writes, only being toward death allows Dasein to be fully itself. So yes, death is the most authentic truth we have, not because it ends life, but because it reveals it. And maybe, just maybe, it's only when we accept that truth that we finally start to live. If God doesn't exist, then everything is permitted. This quote, often linked to Dostoevsky and central to the brothers Karamazov, is one of the deepest existential dilemmas in philosophy. It's not just a theological provocation. It's a painful cry about what remains of morality, meaning, and human responsibility in a world where God is absent. In the novel, this tension is embodied by the Karamazov brothers: Ivan, the rationalist; Alyosha, the devout believer; and Dmitri, the impulsive one. Each represents a side of the human struggle with freedom, faith, and guilt. It's Ivan, the most intellectually tormented, who poses the question, if God doesn't exist, does morality fall apart? The question is complex. For many, God is the ultimate foundation of morality, the invisible lawgiver who defines right and wrong, who justifies sacrifice, who promises justice. Without him, wouldn't the world descend into moral chaos? But Dostoevsky doesn't offer easy answers. He wants the reader to stare into the abyss. When Ivan says that without God, everything would be permitted, he isn't celebrating the idea. He's terrified by it. Because without a higher authority, humans become the sole judges of their own actions. And that's both liberating and horrifying. Suddenly, there are no sacred commandments, no heaven as a reward, no hell as punishment. There's only conscience, exposed, fragile, alone. And here's the even darker possibility. If God doesn't exist, does anything matter? God's absence doesn't just remove external moral boundaries. It might dissolve the meaning of existence itself. Why be good? Why fight for justice? Why suffer, love, or forgive? If everything ends in nothingness, what value do our choices really have? Dostoevsky explores all of this, but never settles it. Instead, he shows that without God, humans have to take on more responsibility, not less. Moral responsibility, when not imposed from above, must be chosen from within. That's why Alyosha is so important. He chooses good, not out of fear of God, but out of love for others. He represents a kind of spirituality rooted in compassion, not blind obedience. The danger, as we see with Ivan, is that reason alone may not be enough to carry the weight of the world. Total freedom can become unbearable. And this is where Dostoevsky anticipates the existentialist dilemmas of the 20th century. Without God, we are free, but we're also forced to justify our own existence. Denying God doesn't free us from ethics. It forces us to rebuild it, or face the void. And that choice, in the end, is deeply personal. There's no manual, no guarantee, only the solitary conscience, deciding between good, evil, or nothing at all. For Friedrich Nietzsche, to live fully isn't just to exist, it's to affirm life in all its intensity, its contradictions, instincts, drives, and suffering. In On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche confronts us with a provocative idea. Moral tradition, especially the Christian moral tradition of the West, wasn't made to set us free. It was made to make us obedient. He starts with a radical question: where do our moral values come from? He doesn't believe that good and evil are eternal truths. Instead, he traces their origins and finds something disturbing: the morality of compassion, humility, and guilt, praised for centuries, didn't come from strength, but from resentment. According to Nietzsche, slave morality was born from the weak, as a reaction against the strong. Unable to express their power, these individuals created a morality that flipped the script. They turned strength into sin, freedom into guilt, passion into weakness. Over time, this morality became tradition. It was passed down as absolute truth, even though it was, in fact, the product of historical domination disguised as virtue. That's where Nietzsche delivers his sharpest critique. Following tradition blindly isn't living, it's obeying. To live fully, we must break from the past that was handed to us. We must question inherited values, deconstruct them, and, more importantly, create new ones. But Nietzsche isn't saying that all tradition is useless or false. This isn't about rebellious rejection of everything that came before. The problem isn't tradition itself, it's our passive relationship with it. When we accept customs, dogmas, and ideas without reflection, our lives become a loop, not a creation. So living fully takes courage. The courage to abandon comforting truths, to face the void that comes when old foundations collapse. Nietzsche writes, "Man is a rope stretched between the animal and the overman. That rope is fragile, and walking it hurts. But it's the only path to an authentic life. Rejecting tradition doesn't mean rejecting all of the past. It means refusing to let the past control the present. It's about freeing ourselves from invisible chains that shape our thoughts, our desires, our choices. By doing that, we become responsible for ourselves, for our values, for our lives." Nietzsche challenges us. Are you living the life you chose, or the life you were taught to accept? That question is the start of every inner revolution. And for him, it's this break from tradition, this bold affirmation of the present, that makes life not just bearable, but complete. Albert Camus, in The Myth of Sisyphus, doesn't write to comfort. He writes to confront the absurd, directly, honestly, without illusions. And that's why he looks at hope, humanity's loyal companion, with suspicion. He asks, is hope just a beautiful way to deny reality? To understand this, we need to grasp the heart of Camus's philosophy. The absurd. The absurd is born from the clash between our desire for meaning and the universe's total silence. Humans want answers, purpose, guarantees, but the world gives us none. Faced with this silence, most people fall into one of two responses: blind faith or hope. Camus rejects both, not out of cynicism, but out of loyalty to raw human experience. To him, hope is often just a way to delay facing reality. When someone says have hope, they might really be saying, don't face the absurd now, wait for something to make it easier later. But what's wrong with that? Camus is clear. Waiting for future meaning is a rejection of the present. It's like saying, life will only be worth it once something justifies it. And in doing that, we stop living. Hope, in this sense, becomes denial, a subtle refusal to accept the absurd for what it is. He writes, to hope is to be always ready not to be. In other words, when we live in hope, we're not really present. We're always betting on tomorrow instead of fully engaging with today. So what's left? What's left is lucid revolt. Camus proposes a radically different attitude. Don't escape, don't deny, don't wait. Instead, accept the absurd and live inside it, fully and without illusions. This revolt isn't bitter, it's active. It's a yes to life without lies. A life that doesn't need promises to be real, it just is. This is where Sisyphus comes in, condemned to push a boulder uphill forever. For Camus, he represents the absurd man, someone who, even in the face of repetition and meaninglessness, refuses to give up. He pushes the rock because that's his life, and in that act, he finds dignity. Camus ends with a striking line. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. So yes, hope, when used as escape, is a form of denial. But there's another option. Live without waiting, without begging, without postponing, and still find greatness in the experience of being alive. Clarity, even without promises, can be more liberating than hope. Søren Kierkegaard was a solitary thinker, and he chose to be. To him, any philosophy that tries to be universal, abstract, and systematic is a betrayal of what truly matters, the concrete, lived experience of the individual. In Fear and Trembling, this idea comes through in the most radical way, especially when he explores the biblical story of Abraham, who, by faith, is willing to sacrifice his own son. No moral, ethical, or rational system can fully explain that, and that's where Kierkegaard forces us to ask, is every system a betrayal of individual existence? For Kierkegaard, the answer is clear, yes, because systems, whether philosophical, moral, or religious, aim for the general, the universal, the things that apply to everyone. But existence is always singular, subjective, paradoxical. What it means to live with faith, to love, to suffer, to choose, these can only be understood from within, from the inner life of the individual. Any attempt to reduce that to rules or categories, Kierkegaard says, is a distortion. In Fear and Trembling, he especially criticizes Hegel's idealism, the philosophical idea that human history and spirit unfold through rational stages. For Kierkegaard, that's a violent simplification of life, because real life isn't logical, predictable, or neatly structured. Life happens through leaps, through anxiety, through choices that can't be explained by any system. Abraham is the ultimate example. He's about to do something ethically unjustifiable, kill his own son. But he acts out of faith, a direct, silent, unshareable relationship with God. Kierkegaard calls this the teleological suspension of the ethical, a moment when universal ethics is set aside in obedience to the absolute. No rational system can grasp that. Only the one living it knows what's truly at stake. That's why Kierkegaard believes that the deepest truth can't be taught like a formula. It must be lived. He writes, "Subjectivity is truth." This isn't shallow relativism. It's the recognition that human life doesn't fit into universal principles. We are thrown into the world as unique individuals, and every choice we make carries a weight that no system can carry for us. So yes, every system, in trying to explain life, risks betraying it, because it turns anxiety into logic, paradox into definition, and freedom into rules. Kierkegaard offers a different path, the path of inwardness, of lived faith, of silence in the face of the unexplainable. A philosophy that doesn't solve the mystery of existence, but invites us to stand inside it with courage. Life isn't a problem to be solved. It's a risk to be taken. And no system, no matter how elegant, can replace the radical responsibility of being yourself. Hell is other people. Few lines have been as widely misunderstood as this one, written by Jean-Paul Sartre in his play No Exit. At first glance, it sounds like an attack on human relationships, like a rejection of others as the cause of our misery. But the truth is more disturbing and more honest. Sartre's line isn't an insult to others. It's an uncomfortable mirror held up to ourselves. In the play, 3 people are trapped together in a room. There's no physical torture, no flames, no demons with pitchforks. And yet, hell is there. Why? Because each character is constantly being watched, judged, and defined by the others. And there's no escape. The other becomes a mirror that pins me down, limits me, turns me into an object. I'm no longer just who I feel I am. I become what the other sees in me. This is Sartre's point. The look of the other has power. It reduces me to a role, a label, an identity I can't control. And worse, I start accepting that image. I begin shaping my life to meet someone else's expectations. Instead of being free, I become a prisoner of what others think of me. But does that mean other people are hell? Not exactly. The real hell is how I position myself in relation to others. It's my need to be seen, loved, approved. It's my fear of being exposed, rejected, or found out. The other is just the trigger. The hell is me, trying to escape myself through the image I project. This is the existential trap Sartre exposes. We want to be free, but we also crave stability, a fixed identity that's safe and validated. And for that, we often give up our freedom. We lie, we perform, we adapt. We live in bad faith, pretending to be what we're not, to please people who don't really see us. Sartre calls us to radical awareness. Hell isn't the other person in themselves. It's the inauthentic way we relate to them. When we let their gaze define us, we lose ownership of our own existence. But there's a way out. It's not in running from others, but in seeing their gaze without becoming their prisoner. It's in owning who we choose to be, even under judgment. Freedom means risking being misunderstood. It means disappointing. It means being wrong. So, Sartre's phrase isn't a final condemnation. It's a warning. If hell is other people, it's because we haven't yet learned to be ourselves in front of them. And maybe full freedom only begins when we stop living for their eyes and finally start existing for our own. Nature created countless forms of life, and all of them, except one, seem to live without the burden of asking why. Animals live, survive, and die. No anxiety, no philosophy, no metaphysics. But humans, with our sharp self-awareness, carry something no other species knows: the knowledge of self, of time, of death, of emptiness. For Émile Cioran, this consciousness is not a gift of evolution. It's its cruelest joke, a curse dressed up as intelligence. Cioran doesn't write like a scientist. He writes like a mystic of despair. In books like The Trouble with Being Born and The Temptation to Exist, he describes human consciousness as an open wound that never heals. To him, thinking too much is the shortest path to being disgusted with life. Consciousness doesn't bring us peace. It steals the innocence of being. He writes, "Life is only bearable because of lies. To think is to suffer." This is one of the core ideas in his philosophy. The act of thinking, of being aware, cuts us off from instinctive, natural living. We become strangers in the world, trapped in a mental maze we built ourselves. And what does this cursed awareness contain? First, the awareness of time. We're the only species that knows it will die. This creates anxiety, fear, urgency. Second, the ability to reflect on ourselves, which brings guilt, regret, and the feeling of failure. Third, the perception of the absurd, the lack of any clear, objective meaning to life. And finally, the awareness of others, which forces us to compete, compare, and often resent. Unlike thinkers who see consciousness as a path to moral or spiritual elevation, Cioran sees it as decline. He believes that civilization's greatest achievements, art, religion, philosophy, are just elegant ways of coping with the unbearable fact that we're aware of being alive, and that being alive is not enough. So why go on? Cioran doesn't offer optimism, but he doesn't call for immediate escape either. What he offers is a kind of ironic clarity. Since we can't go back to animal ignorance, we might as well laugh at the tragedy. His nihilism isn't desperate, it's aesthetic, a kind of dance over the abyss. He writes, "The problem is not being, it's being aware of being." So yes, consciousness is an evolutionary curse, not because it's useless, but because it gives us access to a pain no other species knows. Consciousness expands life, but it also poisons it. And still, here we are, thinking, writing, remembering, doubting, condemned to know, and to carry that knowing to the end. In The Rebel, Albert Camus asks a question that cuts through centuries of political thought. How can we act ethically in an unjust world? And even more, is it possible to maintain an existential ethic based on dignity and individual responsibility within the framework of institutional politics, with all its power games, ideologies, and compromises? For Camus, this tension is central. Existential ethics is born from the personal experience of the absurd, the awareness that life has no pre-assigned meaning. But instead of falling into nihilism, the rebel, the one who refuses to accept injustice as normal, affirms life, not by clinging to dogmas, but through fidelity to the concrete human being. Revolt, in this sense, is not mindless destruction. It's an ethical demand. I rebel, therefore I exist. But this is where the conflict begins. Authentic revolt is individual, intimate, moral. Institutional politics, by contrast, tends to become collective, abstract, and often violent. Camus examines how major ideologies, whether religious or revolutionary, betrayed this ethical stance. In the name of a greater good, they committed atrocities. The 20th century, with Nazism and Stalinism, revealed what happens when politics abandons the individual and adopts the logic of sacrifice, killing today for a promised paradise tomorrow. This, for Camus, is the ultimate ethical betrayal, justifying murder in the name of justice. He rejects that completely. To Camus, no political system should ever demand the death of an innocent person for the sake of an ideal. Existential ethics imposes a clear limit. Human beings must never be used as means to an end. And that's exactly what institutional politics often ignores. It deals in masses, numbers, strategies. It erases the individual. But does that mean existential ethics and politics are incompatible? Camus says no. He admits that politics is necessary, we live in society, and collective action is inevitable. But he urges constant vigilance, a kind of politics that preserves the individual as an end in themselves, a politics of moderation, of limits, of refusing absolutes. He writes, anything that goes beyond the limits of man leads to dehumanization. In this light, existential ethics should serve as a critical conscience within politics. It prevents ends from justifying means. It reminds us that no ideal is worth more than a real, living person. Camus advocates for revolt that doesn't turn into tyranny, and for freedom that doesn't collapse into chaos. So no, existential ethics is not incompatible with politics, but it is deeply incompatible with politics when it becomes blind ideology, raw power, or secular religion. The ethics of the rebel doesn't reject politics. It demands that politics never forget the human face behind every decision. In times of extremism and dogma, Camus reminds us, there is no true revolution without compassion. In The Ethics of Ambiguity, Simone de Beauvoir dives into one of the most delicate questions of human freedom. How can I love someone without giving up myself? Or, in existentialist terms, is it possible to love another person without betraying my freedom as a subject? For Beauvoir, to be human is to live in ambiguity. We are at once pure freedom and embodied reality. We are subjects, capable of choosing, acting, creating, and at the same time, we are objects, limited by the world, by time, by the gaze of others. This tension is unavoidable, and it shows up most clearly in love. In love, there's a deep desire for fusion. We want to unite with the other, to fully understand them, to be fully understood. But this desire crashes into an existentialist truth. The other is radically free. That means they'll always be beyond our control. I can't possess them, I can't fully know them, and I can't guarantee they'll love me forever. So love exists between two freedoms, always in tension. And this brings the question, do I have to give myself up in order to love? Beauvoir says this is often exactly what happens, especially in traditions that teach women to live for the other, to find their identity in serving or sacrificing for love. This kind of total devotion, trying to become one with someone else, is a form of bad faith. It's a denial of one's own freedom in exchange for an illusion of security or meaning. To betray yourself for love, Beauvoir warns, is to destroy both yourself and the relationship. Because real love doesn't thrive on the erasure of the self. It thrives on the recognition of each person's freedom. So, is loving someone a betrayal of your freedom? Not necessarily, but it can be. It's a risk. The risk of giving too much, of losing yourself in the other, of turning love into dependency, idolization, or submission. But Beauvoir offers a way out. She proposes ethical love, a love built on mutual recognition of freedom. A love that doesn't seek to possess, but to accompany. That doesn't require self-sacrifice, but shared growth. A love that isn't frozen in eternal promises, but renewed every day through free choice. She writes, "To want the other to be free is to want their existence as much as your own. That means real love doesn't threaten freedom, it confirms it. But that takes maturity, courage, and above all, clarity. The ability to love someone who will always be a separate person." So no, love doesn't have to be a betrayal. It can be instead a pact of freedom. A space where two whole people choose, without guarantees, to walk side by side. Authenticity. It's often praised as a modern virtue, a sign of inner freedom and personal truth. But when taken seriously, it becomes uncomfortable. Because for thinkers like Sartre and Nietzsche, being authentic isn't just about being yourself. It means refusing to be what others expect you to be. And that has a cost, a social cost. Jean-Paul Sartre, in Being and Nothingness, describes how we constantly live under the gaze of others. We're always tempted to play roles, to be the perfect student, the model employee, the good citizen. Most people, he says, live in bad faith, pretending that those roles are their true selves. But in reality, we are freedom, and to live authentically is to own that freedom fully without hiding behind ready-made identities. The problem? Society doesn't like radical freedom. Being authentic means breaking expectations, challenging norms, questioning the status quo. It means stepping off the script. And that makes people uncomfortable. Authenticity threatens the smooth functioning of a world based on predictable behavior and unspoken rules. Nietzsche goes even further. In books like Thus Spoke Zarathustra and Beyond Good and Evil, he argues that society, the herd, tries to flatten individuals, erase differences, and suppress creative power. The authentic person, the one who creates their own values, is seen as dangerous, arrogant, or unfit. That's why Nietzsche writes about the free spirit, the one who refuses to be tamed. But that spirit is often alone. He walks through deserts where few dare follow. So, for both thinkers, authenticity isn't comfortable. It's an act of courage, and often an act of isolation. The authentic person may challenge morality, religion, and popular taste. They don't live to please. They live to stay true to their experience of the world. And yes, that can look, or feel, antisocial. But that doesn't mean hating others. Neither Sartre nor Nietzsche encourage misanthropy. What they reject is superficial relationships built on lies, conformity, and the repression of the self. The real issue isn't living with others, it's living for others. So the question isn't whether authenticity requires cutting ties with society. It's how we can live among others without losing ourselves. And that takes balance. Authenticity doesn't mean rejecting all social life. It means keeping your integrity, even when it costs you approval. Nietzsche wrote, "He who cannot live alone should not think of being free." And Sartre reminds us, hell is other people, but only when we let them define who we are. So no, being authentic doesn't mean being against people, but it's rarely welcomed by them. And maybe that discomfort is the sign that authenticity is still possible and deeply needed. Living authentically often means breaking away from what we've inherited. It means rejecting ready-made roles, collective expectations, and norms that were never chosen, only imposed. But how far can we go in being true to ourselves without clashing with the social structures that shape us from birth? Do we have to commit a kind of symbolic violence against tradition in order to be authentic? Friedrich Nietzsche and Simone de Beauvoir, each in their own way, say yes. For Nietzsche, in works like On the Genealogy of Morals and the Antichrist, traditional morality, Christian, European, bourgeois, is not a path to virtue, but a system built to tame human vitality. Customs for him are tools of domestication. They teach guilt, forced humility, obedience, and fear of difference. Against this, Nietzsche offers the figure of the free spirit, the creator of values, the one who dares to affirm their own will against the herd. But this act of creation is necessarily violent, even if only symbolically. It destroys idols, profanes sacred truths, mocks moral conventions. Nietzsche isn't advocating physical violence. He calls for a revaluation of all values, a radical inversion of what we're taught. He writes, "One must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. That chaos is the break from tradition, and without it, authenticity is impossible." Simone de Beauvoir, in The Second Sex and the Ethics of Ambiguity, shows how deeply customs shape the experience of being a woman. From a young age, society teaches a model of femininity rooted in passivity, sacrifice, and submission. Women are trained to see themselves as the other, an extension of man, not as free subjects. To be authentic in this context is to transgress, and Beauvoir knows this transgression is not just personal. It directly challenges the foundations of patriarchy. A woman who refuses her traditional role, who chooses her career, her body, her desires, threatens the symbolic structure that holds these customs together. That's why she will often be judged, punished, or pushed to the margins. But it's through that conflict that authenticity gains its ethical power. To affirm yourself as a subject is to confront the system itself. So, for both Nietzsche and Beauvoir, authenticity is not a peaceful act. It confronts, destabilizes, and disrupts. It requires the courage to say no to what seems natural, but is actually just habitual. That no is a form of symbolic violence, but it's a necessary one. It opens space for what's new, for what's real, for what's truly lived. To be authentic is not to adapt, it is to revolt. It's not about rejecting all tradition, but about refusing to live as a mirror of what others have already thought, said, or desired. Authenticity is an act of creation, and every act of creation demands rupture. Søren Kierkegaard may be the philosopher who most boldly described faith as a leap into the dark, an act that's deeply irrational yet absolutely necessary. In works like The Seducer's Diary, faith isn't the explicit theme, but Kierkegaard contrasts two ways of life: the light, playful life of seduction, focused on immediate pleasure, and the serious call of an ethical and spiritual life, where the individual must make meaningful choices. And it's exactly within that choice that faith appears, not as certainty, but as paradox, as lucid madness. Kierkegaard describes three stages of existence: aesthetic, pleasure, play, avoidance of responsibility; ethical, recognition of freedom and responsibility; religious, the leap of faith beyond reason. The aesthetic stage, embodied by Johannes the Seducer, avoids despair and mortality through distraction. But that path eventually leads to emptiness. The leap happens when the individual enters the ethical stage, when they begin to build themselves consciously, taking responsibility for their choices. Yet even reason, Kierkegaard says, can't save us from existential despair. At that limit, faith appears, not as a logical solution, but as an absurd surrender. So, is faith a form of madness? Yes, but it's a lucid madness, one that sees the absurd and chooses anyway. For Kierkegaard, the believer doesn't ignore the paradox, They embrace it. Faith demands believing even when everything points to impossibility. Abraham's story, his willingness to sacrifice his son out of obedience to God, is the perfect example. Ethically, it's a crime. In faith, it's sublime. This leap can't be explained, only lived. But unlike blind madness that denies reality, Kierkegaard's faith is lucid. It knows despair, faces anxiety, and still decides. The believer doesn't escape reason. They go beyond it. They know there are no guarantees, but they still commit. Not out of illusion, but out of choice. In contrast to aesthetic seduction, which avoids depth, faith is the deepest commitment. A silent inner act that can't be taught or proven. Kierkegaard writes, "Faith is the highest and hardest achievement of all, because it requires believing without seeing, and continuing to believe when everything collapses. So yes, existential faith is a kind of madness, but it's a courageous madness, one that rises from extreme clarity, a paradoxical response to life's absurdity, not with despair, but with hope, not with certainty, but with loyalty to something greater than reason alone." In The Myth of Sisyphus, Albert Camus asks one of the most unsettling questions in modern philosophy. How can we keep living in a world with no guaranteed meaning? Faced with the silence of the universe, inevitable death, and the absence of divine order to justify suffering, Camus introduces his central idea, the absurd. So, what is the absurd? It's the clash between the human desire for clarity, meaning, and eternity, and the cold indifference of the world. The absurd doesn't lie in us or in the universe. It lies in the encounter between the two. We crave ultimate answers. The universe gives us nothing. It's in that deadlock that Camus rejects both surrender and false hope. And here, he takes on religion directly. To Camus, traditional religious faith is a kind of emotional and logical leap that denies the absurd. It imposes a ready-made meaning onto chaos, filling the void with a redemptive story. In other words, it's a form of escape, a comprehensible one, but an escape nonetheless. That's why Camus says, accepting the absurd is more honest than turning to religion, because the absurd doesn't offer rewards, comfort, or a made-up God who guarantees justice or purpose. It demands that we face life as it truly is, incomplete, unpredictable, finite, and still say yes to it. Religion, in Camus' view, isn't dishonest out of malice, but out of refusal. It denies the absurd in favor of a moral or metaphysical order, and in doing so, it betrays clarity. It offers hope where there are no guarantees. It promises eternity where only death exists. It gives meaning where there is only experience. The religious person makes peace with the world through faith. The absurd person rebels against the lack of meaning, without denying it. But Camus doesn't hate religion. He understands its historical, emotional, even existential role. What he criticizes is how religion can block people from taking responsibility for their own lives. By handing meaning over to something beyond us, we give up the freedom to shape our path. That's why he turns to Sisyphus, condemned to roll the same boulder up a hill forever. But by accepting his fate, Sisyphus becomes free. Camus ends with a bold line. We must imagine Sisyphus happy. Not because he found meaning, but because he rejected the lie. So yes, the absurd is more honest than religion, because it doesn't promise what it can't deliver. It asks us to live awake, without illusions and without resignation. To live not despite the emptiness, but because we know it's there. And that kind of courage for Camus is the highest form of human dignity. Who are we really? When we say I, where does that certainty come from? Is there a stable, fixed core inside us, a permanent essence that defines who we are? For philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Friedrich Nietzsche, the answer is bold and unsettling. The self isn't real. It's a useful fiction, an invention that helps give shape to our lives, but in essence, isn't real. Nietzsche starts by questioning language itself. In Beyond Good and Evil, he criticizes how philosophers treat the I as something solid, like a substance. He blames this on religious and Western metaphysics, which need a soul, a fixed identity, a hidden truth. But Nietzsche breaks it all down. The I isn't the cause of actions, it's the effect. He writes, "Thinking is an activity, but where is the thinker? The I is a grammatical fiction." For Nietzsche, what we call the self is actually a messy mix of forces, instincts, drives, always in conflict. There's no center. The self is just a label we slap onto that chaos. It helps us navigate life, to create memory, continuity, but it's still a mask. Sartre echoes this in his own way. In Being and Nothingness, he insists that humans have no pre-given essence. We aren't born with a true self to discover. Instead, we exist first and define ourselves later. He famously says, "Existence precedes essence." For Sartre, the I is a story in progress, a work in constant creation. We're unfinished. And any attempt to define ourselves too rigidly, "That's just who I am," is bad faith. It's a way of escaping the freedom to become something new. So both Nietzsche and Sartre agree. The self isn't real in a permanent, fixed way, but that doesn't make it useless. In fact, it's necessary. It gives us a narrative, a thread, a tool to act and reflect. But when we believe in that fiction too deeply, it becomes a trap. It forces us to live by labels, expectations, and appearances, instead of embracing the freedom and responsibility of constant reinvention. The self is useful as a story, but dangerous as a supposed truth. Sartre and Nietzsche both call for lucidity. Life is about creating yourself, not discovering who you really are. The self is not a starting point. It's a task. Maybe the I is like a shadow. It has no substance of its own, but it follows our steps. And real maturity is learning not to mistake the shadow for the body that casts it. Living with total clarity sounds like a virtue at first, but is it really? What if facing reality with no filters, no illusions, and no justifications isn't just difficult, but unbearable? In Being and Nothingness, Jean-Paul Sartre explores this dilemma with radical honesty, and his conclusion is unsettling. To endure freedom, absurdity, and the anxiety of existence, we might need to lie to ourselves. Sartre calls this self-deception bad faith, mauvaise foi. It's the state we retreat to in order to avoid the weight of our freedom. For Sartre, human beings are not fixed entities. We have no essence. We are pure freedom, condemned to choose, to act, and to create ourselves from moment to moment. But that freedom is heavy. To be totally free means to be totally responsible. There are no excuses, no guarantees, no fate to blame. So what do? We invent roles, identities, and certainties. We pretend to be something: a doctor, a parent, a patriot, an artist, a rebel. But deep down, we know none of these roles are final. No label can fully define us. That's when we enter into bad faith. We pretend we're not free, that we are the roles we play, and nothing more. We act as if we have no choice, to avoid the anxiety of having to choose. Sartre gives the example of a cafe waiter who acts overly waiter-like, as if his entire being is wrapped up in how he serves, moves, and behaves. But he's performing. He's not a waiter in any essential way. He's choosing to be one in that moment. When he forgets this, he's lying to himself to avoid the burden of freedom. But is bad faith just cowardice, or is it necessary? Sartre isn't naive. He knows that complete awareness can be paralyzing. To constantly live with the knowledge that we're creating meaning from nothing, with nothing to protect us from despair, requires strength few can sustain. That's why self-deception, even if it's bad faith, can act as a psychological shield, a temporary relief from the abyss. A life lived with no self-deception at all is almost impossible. Even Sartre admits that bad faith is nearly unavoidable. But he's not asking us to be perfect, only to become more aware of the lies we tell ourselves and why. Freedom doesn't require perfection. It requires responsibility. So, yes, maybe life without any self-deception is unbearable. But living in total illusion is its own kind of death. The real challenge is to find the point where lucidity becomes creative, not crushing. Sartre invites us down that difficult but necessary path, to see, to choose, to take ownership, even when it hurts. In his famous lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism, Jean-Paul Sartre introduces one of the most revolutionary ideas in modern philosophy. Existence precedes essence. This phrase, the slogan of existentialism, means that human beings are not born with a fixed nature or a pre-written morality. We exist first, and only then define ourselves through our actions and choices. But that raises a deep question. If there's no predetermined essence, does that mean morality comes later too? Does existence come before ethics? Sartre says yes, and in doing so, he breaks away from centuries of tradition that rooted morality in God, reason, or human nature. To Sartre, there is no eternal moral code written into the fabric of the universe. No objective values telling us what's right or wrong before we choose. We are born, thrown into the world, without instructions or divine guarantees. And because of that, we are radically free. But that freedom isn't easy. It's a burden. Because when we act, we're not just deciding for ourselves. We're defining what we believe a human being should be. Every choice becomes a model we are willing to recommend to others. So even without a fixed moral code, we still create values through how we live. And we're fully responsible for those values. In this way, morality doesn't disappear. It becomes something we create, grounded in real, situated human existence. The key difference is this: morality no longer comes from outside, from some higher authority. It comes from within. It's not about obeying rules, it's about owning who we choose to be. Sartre rejects the idea that without God, or a human essence, anything goes. On the contrary, the lack of pre-made morality forces us to invent values with responsibility. We can't hide behind dogmas. Each action must be claimed, fully. That's why Sartre says, man is condemned to be free. Condemned because we didn't choose to exist, but once we do, we can't escape freedom. Even not choosing is a choice. Existence comes first, and then we must build, through action, what we mean by good, justice, and dignity. So yes, morality comes after existence. But that doesn't free us from ethical duty. It gives us back the authorship. To live is to choose, and every choice affirms a value. We are at once creators of meaning and responsible for it. In The Sickness. Unto Death, Søren Kierkegaard describes one of the deepest and most painful experiences of human existence: the despair of not being yourself. This despair, he says, is silent, invisible, and often buried under the surface. It shows up when we avoid ourselves, when we reject our freedom and hide behind roles or other people's expectations. But what does it mean to choose yourself? And is that a selfish act, or paradoxically, a necessary one? For Kierkegaard, the human being is a synthesis of finitude and infinitude. What we are given, our body, history, circumstances, and what we choose, our spirit, our direction, our purpose. When we live only on the surface, chasing pleasure, status, or approval, we're avoiding the real task, to consciously become ourselves. So choosing yourself isn't narcissism, it's the first step out of despair. It means accepting that no one can live your life for you. Your existence is a unique and unrepeatable responsibility. For Kierkegaard, the greatest tragedy isn't physical death, it's spiritual death. It's living as someone else, the perfect employee, the ideal wife, the rebel, the obedient child, without ever touching your true self. But why does this choice feel selfish? Because it often means breaking expectations. It can look like rejecting tradition, family duties, or social norms. It requires saying no to many things in order to say a true yes to yourself. And that comes with pain, conflict, and judgment. But Kierkegaard insists, without this inner movement, we live in lies. And the worst lie is the one we tell ourselves. The real selfishness isn't choosing yourself. It's fleeing from yourself, manipulating others, or hiding behind masks. The person who chooses themselves in an ethical way is actually preparing to love others truthfully, because only someone who accepts their own identity can meet the other as an equal, not as a reflection or crutch. Kierkegaard writes, "The self is a relation that relates to itself." To choose yourself means stepping into that mirror, facing fear, doubt, and the possibility of failure, and going forward anyway. It's an existential leap, one that doesn't erase uncertainty, but moves through it with faith. So no, choosing yourself is not selfish in the shallow sense. It's a spiritual and ethical act. It's a mark of maturity and courage. It doesn't mean ignoring others. It means understanding that you can only give what you truly are. To love, to act, to create. All of it begins with the commitment to your own truth. In the myth of Sisyphus, Albert Camus confronts what he calls the most fundamental question in philosophy. Is life worth living? Instead of seeking comfort in religion, rational promises, or metaphysical fantasies, he chooses a harsher path, the path of the absurd. For Camus, the absurd is born from the clash between the human longing for meaning, order, and clarity, and the universe's cold, indifferent silence. We desperately want life to mean something, but reality offers no guarantees, no ultimate answers, no higher purpose. And it's in that tension that the central question arises. What do we do with this emptiness? According to Camus, many people choose escape. They turn to religious faith, political ideologies, or even philosophical systems that promise total meaning. But Camus is blunt. These solutions are betrayals of clarity. To reject the absurd isn't an act of courage. It's giving in to fear, fear of chaos, of doubt, of true freedom. That's why, for Camus, rejecting the absurd, denying it, or covering it up with comforting explanations, is an act of intellectual cowardice. He calls this philosophical suicide. When thought, unable to deal with the discomfort of meaninglessness, surrenders to convenient answers. Camus doesn't hate believers. He understands the human impulse to seek comfort. But philosophically, he demands honesty, brutal honesty, in the face of reality. That means accepting the fact that the world wasn't made for us, that death is the end, and that the universe offers no built-in moral order. To deny this is like building a sandcastle on despair. Still, Camus is not a nihilist. He doesn't say life is worthless. Instead, he proposes an ethic of revolt, to live fully, even knowing that life has no ultimate meaning. This isn't resignation, it's defiance. Like Sisyphus, condemned to roll a boulder uphill for eternity, the absurd hero is the one who, knowing life is futile, still chooses to push the stone, and finds freedom in doing so. Camus writes, "The absurd depends as much on man as on the world." In other words, it's not a final sentence, it's a relationship. And because of that, it can be faced with dignity, to live without appeals, without illusions, without false promises, to live fully, here and now, with awareness and courage. So yes, rejecting the absurd is more than a theoretical error. It's an existential escape. It's a refusal to carry the weight of the freedom that awareness gives us. And in that sense, it is an act of intellectual cowardice, choosing the comforting lie over the disturbing truth. Camus offers another path. The courage to live without meaning, and to still say yes to life. Not despite the absurd, but because of it. Freedom is often seen as something purely positive, almost sacred. But both Jean-Paul Sartre and Martin Heidegger warn us, the more free we are, the more unstable we become. That's because, for these thinkers, freedom isn't just about choosing between options. It's about being thrown into a world with no guarantees, no fixed identity, and no pre-written script. And that can lead not to peace, but to an identity crisis. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre is clear. Man is condemned to be free. He doesn't mean political or legal freedom. He's talking about existential freedom. We have no preset essence. We're not defined by nature, God, or society. We are what we choose to become, action by action, choice by choice. But this radical freedom comes at a cost. Identity becomes fluid. There's no solid ground, no true self to uncover, only a self we must invent and reinvent over and over again. The more we realize this, the more we feel the vertigo of freedom. Who am I if I can be anything? Worse, who am I if I can stop being what I am at any moment? Heidegger, in Being and Time, doesn't use the phrase absolute freedom, but he talks about authenticity, living in a way that truly belongs to you, not just following what everyone else does. For Heidegger, most people live inauthentically. They follow routines, traditions, expectations. But when we confront death, the fact that our time is finite, we're forced to take ownership of our life. Still, this authenticity doesn't bring comfort. It strips away easy answers. There's no guide for being real. Each person must invent their own way of being, and that can be terrifying. So yes, for both Sartre and Heidegger, absolute freedom can lead to a collapse of identity if we think identity is something fixed, stable, and permanent. Freedom dissolves our certainties. That can lead to anxiety, confusion, even a loss of meaning. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. For both thinkers, this instability is the soil where authenticity grows. Identity, in this view, isn't something we find. It's something we do, something we build, unbuild, and rebuild. Freedom doesn't destroy who we are. It forces us to take full responsibility for becoming. And maybe that's where real maturity begins. Not in finding a fixed self, but in accepting that to be free is also to be unfinished. We're often taught that happiness is the natural goal of life, the promise of well-being, harmony, and fulfillment. But for philosophers like Søren Kierkegaard and Martin Heidegger, that's not the whole story. For them, it's anxiety, not happiness, that reveals the deeper truth of being human. In the concept of anxiety, Kierkegaard describes anxiety as existential. It's not just fear of something specific. It's a sense of unease in the face of nothingness, of the open space of freedom. It emerges when we realize, I can choose. I'm responsible for who I become, and no one else can choose for me. Even a child, before understanding what mistakes are, can feel anxiety when they first sense that their actions are their own. So anxiety, for Kierkegaard, isn't a flaw. It's the sign that we are truly free. Happiness, on the other hand, can often be shallow or disconnected from reality. Anxiety brings us closer to who we really are. Heidegger takes this further in Being and Time. For him, anxiety, angst, is what breaks through the routine of daily life. In everyday existence, we get lost in distractions, in what they say, do, or expect. We forget our mortality. We forget that our time is limited. But sometimes, in moments of deep silence, grief, or emptiness, anxiety hits, and suddenly the world feels strange. Nothing makes sense. Even we feel unfamiliar to ourselves. But it's in that moment that Heidegger says we see most clearly. Anxiety reveals the truth. It strips away illusions and puts us face to face with the raw mystery of existence. Happiness rarely does that. So yes, for Kierkegaard and Heidegger, anxiety is more real than happiness. Not because happiness is fake, but because it's often built on illusions, security, permanence, and promises of meaning. Anxiety doesn't lie. It shows us the void, but also our freedom. That doesn't mean we should seek out anxiety or reject joy when it comes. The point is this: anxiety is not a flaw to fix. It's a truth to face. It's the ground where authenticity can grow. And maybe, in the end, real happiness, not the light, easy kind, but the deep kind, can only come after we've faced anxiety with full awareness. In The Rebel, Albert Camus invites us to reflect on a fundamental human impulse: the refusal to accept injustice, that raw cry of enough, the moment when human dignity is violated, when freedom is denied, when the order of the world becomes unbearable. According to Camus, that cry is the root of rebellion, not as blind destruction, but as an ethical affirmation of life. But here's the question: is rebellion more authentic than reform? Is resisting the system head-on a truer gesture than working within it to create gradual change? Camus doesn't give a direct answer, but his position is clear. For him, rebellion is born from a real experience of absurdity and injustice. The rebel isn't a nihilist. On the contrary, by rejecting what's intolerable, the rebel affirms that there is something worth saving. To rebel is to say no, but also to say yes to human dignity. Reform, on the other hand, is often institutional. It works within the system's limits through negotiations and adjustments. It's important, but sometimes insufficient. Camus is wary of reform when it gets too comfortable, when it sacrifices justice for stability, when it adapts the rebel to the world instead of transforming the world to make space for the rebel. Rebellion, then, is more existential. It's not just about laws or policies. It's about a person's refusal to accept the unacceptable, even if that means breaking away from everything. That's why rebellion can feel more authentic, because it begins in a deep, individual awareness. I can't keep pretending this is okay. To keep going without protesting would be a betrayal of one's own integrity. Still, Camus warns, rebellion can turn corrupt when it forgets its original purpose, defending humanity, and becomes an absolute ideology. It risks turning into tyranny. History is full of revolutions that committed horrors in the name of justice. So Camus insists on measure. Rebellion must be ethical, not totalitarian. Reform can be strategic, but rebellion is the starting point of authenticity, because it rises from a clear sense of injustice and a refusal to be tamed. The reformer may tolerate the absurd a little longer. The rebel can't take it anymore. So yes, when faithful to its principles, rebellion is more authentic than reform, because it's not just about changing the world, it's also about transforming oneself into someone worthy of change. Camus writes, "To rebel is to affirm that something deserves respect. Reform can be a path, but rebellion is the spark that reignites the meaning of freedom, with no guarantees, but full awareness." Death is perhaps the only absolute fact of human existence. Everyone knows it's coming, and yet we spend much of life trying to forget it. For philosophers like Martin Heidegger and Emile Cioran, death is more than just the biological end. It's a total existential experience, and for some, maybe even a kind of liberation. But is that rationally justifiable? Heidegger's approach in Being and Time is more ontological than emotional. He doesn't treat death as an escape, but as a fundamental horizon of existence. He says we are beings toward death, sein zum Tod, meaning death is not just something that happens at the end of life. It's a possibility that's always with us. It's non-transferable, non-negotiable, and deeply personal. And it's precisely this awareness of our finitude that gives life its meaning. Heidegger doesn't argue that death should be desired, but that acknowledging it allows us to live authentically. Denying it through distraction, denial, or superficial living leads to inauthenticity. So for Heidegger, death isn't a form of liberation from pain, it's liberation from illusion. Facing death means waking up to life. Now, Emile Cioran, in works like The Trouble with Being Born or A Short History of Decay, is much darker and more direct. For him, life often feels like a burden with no clear purpose, and human consciousness, that tragic luxury, makes us painfully aware of death, time, and emptiness. We are the only creatures who know we're going to die, and that knowledge can feel unbearable. So Cioran asks, why go on? Unlike Heidegger, Cioran openly entertains the idea that death can be a legitimate relief, not as a desperate act, but as a philosophical choice made with clarity and reflection. He doesn't glorify suicide, but he doesn't condemn it either. For him, the freedom to end one's life is the ultimate freedom. He once wrote, "The thought of suicide is a great consolation. It helps us get through many dark nights." So, between these two thinkers, we find different but related answers. Heidegger sees death as a reminder of how to live. Cioran sees it as an exit from the suffering of being aware. The real question then becomes, is it justifiable to go on living at any cost? So yes, death as liberation can be rationally justified. Heidegger and Cioran disagree on its meaning, but they both refuse illusions. And maybe that's the deeper connection between them. To face death honestly, without fear and without lies. From the very beginning, philosophy has asked the same central question: what is the meaning of life? But Friedrich Nietzsche, in The Birth of Tragedy, flips that question on its head. What if the problem isn't the lack of meaning, but the need to search for it in the first place? What if this obsession with meaning is actually a sign of weakness? In his analysis of Greek tragedy, Nietzsche presents two opposing forces, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. The Apollonian represents order, reason, beauty, and harmony. The Dionysian stands for chaos, instinct, intoxication, and the collapse of the self. For Nietzsche, Greek tragedy was powerful because it embraced both. Life includes light and darkness, structure and madness. And the Greeks accepted that. But over time, Western civilization lost that balance. Socrates, rationalism, and later Christianity began to favor the Apollonian. Reason, morality, and meaning were elevated above all else. The wild, chaotic side of life, the Dionysian, was pushed down. So Nietzsche asks, do we seek meaning out of strength or out of fear? For him, many people chase meaning not out of courage, but because they're scared of randomness, pain, death, and uncertainty. To deal with that fear, we invent moral systems, religious myths, and absolute truths. We try to make life more tolerable, even if that means lying to ourselves. Nietzsche calls this passive nihilism, the desire to believe in something comforting, even if it's false. The tragic spirit, on the other hand, accepts that life can be brutal and irrational, and still says yes to it. It doesn't need everything to make sense. It embraces pain, chaos, and suffering as part of what it means to be alive. Nietzsche admired the Dionysian because it represented the power to live without justification. So yes, the search for meaning can be a sign of weakness when it's driven by fear or the refusal to face reality. But Nietzsche doesn't say we should never create meaning. He just warns us not to treat it as absolute or eternal. The strong individual, the free spirit, creates their own values. Not to escape life, but to affirm it. So the issue isn't seeking meaning. It's seeking it as an escape, instead of as an act of strength. Meaning should never be a crutch. It should be an expression of courage, even knowing it's always temporary. In Being and Nothingness, Jean-Paul Sartre presents a radical idea. Human beings are absolutely free, and therefore absolutely responsible. There is no God, no fixed human nature, no pre-written fate, nothing to blame. Every choice, every action, even our inactions, are ours alone. But this kind of freedom is not just liberating, it's terrifying. Because if nothing is predetermined, then everything depends on us. And not just personally, but universally. When I choose for myself, I'm also saying, this is what a human being can be. Sartre writes, man is condemned to be free. Condemned because we didn't choose to exist, but once we're here, we can't escape the responsibility of defining ourselves. Even refusing to choose is a choice. We're responsible for our actions, for our failures, for our emotions, even for our guilt. This idea shatters all comfort zones. We can't say, I had no choice, or I was just following orders, or everyone else does it. For Sartre, these are bad faith, lies we tell ourselves to avoid the weight of being free. But here's the hard question. Can we really handle this much responsibility? In real life, it's tough. Knowing that everything is on us, and that no one will save us or forgive us, can lead to anxiety, paralysis, or even despair. Many people escape it by clinging to roles, ideologies, relationships, by being things instead of free beings. But Sartre insists, only by owning our freedom can we be authentic. Yes, it's a heavy burden, but it's also what gives our lives dignity. To run from it is to live in bad faith, to give up on ourselves. Still, Sartre doesn't romanticize freedom. He knows it's lonely, disturbing, sometimes tragic. We're carrying the world on our shoulders, but we still have to walk. Not because it's heroic, but because there's no other way. So yes, total responsibility is hard, sometimes unbearable, but not because freedom is a punishment, but because it forces us to live without outside help. We are both the authors and the judges of our lives, and that takes courage. Sartre doesn't offer comfort, he offers clarity. He doesn't promise freedom will make you happy, but he shows it's the only thing that makes you fully human. And if the weight feels too heavy, maybe it's because we've expected life to be easier than it really is. Responsibility is tough, but it's what gives our choices meaning. Running from it may feel safer, but facing it, even when afraid, is where authenticity begins. Albert Camus isn't the kind of thinker who offers comforting answers. He offers uncomfortable truths. In The Stranger, his most iconic novel, Camus presents a character, Meursault, who lives without pretending, without wearing masks, and most of all, without illusions. And through him, Camus forces us to ask, is everything we call meaning in life, love, justice, religion, success, nothing more than fragile constructs we create so we don't have to face the void? Meursault's story is simple, but unsettling. He seems indifferent to life's events. He doesn't cry at his mother's funeral, doesn't get emotional with his girlfriend's love, and ends up killing a man without much reason. But what really disturbs people isn't the crime, it's his honesty. Meursault refuses to lie about what he feels, and it's that refusal that condemns him, not legally, but socially. Camus uses him to show what happens when someone chooses to live without illusions. Meursault doesn't try to find meaning where there is none. He accepts the absurd, the fact that life is indifferent, death is inevitable, and no story can change that reality. Most people need to believe in something, a purpose, eternal love, objective morality, a God who gives meaning to suffering. But according to Camus, this search for meaning isn't a discovery, it's an invention. The human mind, faced with the silence of the universe, creates stories to justify pain and mortality. It's understandable, but philosophically, it's also a voluntary illusion. Camus writes, "The absurd is born from the confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. The need is our craving for meaning. The silence is the universe's refusal to answer. When we can't handle that silence, we invent a meaning, often religious or metaphysical, to fill the gap. But by doing that, we trade honesty for comfort." Meursault represents the possibility of living without denying the absurd. He doesn't justify his actions, doesn't cling to morality, doesn't beg for forgiveness. He simply lives, and in the end, accepts his death with almost cosmic calm. Not because he found a deeper meaning, but because he let go of the need for one. So yes, for Camus, every meaning we assign to life is a voluntary illusion if it's meant to deny the absurd truth. But he's not saying life isn't worth living. Quite the opposite. It's because life has no pre-made meaning that we can live it with freedom, courage, and intensity. The mistake isn't in giving life meaning. The mistake is believing that meaning comes from outside, as an absolute truth. The real challenge is to create a personal meaning without lying to yourself, and to live it honestly, even knowing the universe remains silent. Albert Camus built his philosophy of the absurd on one simple, devastating idea. The world doesn't offer any inherent meaning to our existence. There's no built-in moral order, no ultimate truth waiting at the end of the road. There's just the human being, craving meaning, and the silence of the universe. So the big question is, if the world is absurd, is it still possible to live a good life? For many, the lack of meaning leads straight to nihilism. If nothing matters, why care about anything? But Camus rejects that path. His philosophy doesn't deny life, it embraces it. In fact, it calls for more intensity, more responsibility, and more joy, not less. He writes, "The absurd does not liberate, it binds. It does not authorize all actions. Everything must be justified again." In other words, the absurd isn't an end. It's a starting point, a launching pad for a more lucid, honest way of living. The good life won't be found in religion, rigid moral codes, or political ideologies. It can only be born out of revolt, not the destructive kind, but the creative kind, the kind that says, even without ultimate meaning, life is still worth it. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus presents the image of the tragic hero condemned to push a boulder uphill forever. The task is pointless. But once Sisyphus becomes aware of that and accepts it, he becomes free. Camus concludes, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy, not because he defeats the absurd, but because he stops lying to himself." So, for Camus, a good life isn't about finding meaning. It's about refusing to run from the truth. A good life chooses lucidity over comfort, freedom over blind obedience, presence over false hope. It means accepting pain, death, and uncertainty, not with resignation, but with dignity and revolt. To live well is to live fully, knowing each moment won't come again, to create beauty, to love, to act justly, not because it's rewarded by the universe, but because we choose to live that way. Camus believed our greatness lies in the ability to say yes to life, even without guarantees. That's not just bravery, it's an ethics of the absurd. So no, a good life is not impossible in an absurd world. It's just harder, because it takes maturity, clarity, and courage. But it's also more personal, more honest, more earned. A good life, in a world with no answers, is one we build ourselves, without illusions, but with full awareness of the gift of being alive. Jean-Paul Sartre, in Being and Nothingness, introduced one of existentialism's most uncomfortable ideas: bad faith, mauvaise foi. Unlike lying to others, bad faith is when you lie to yourself. It's when you pretend you're not free, that you're not responsible for your own choices. But why would anyone do that? And more importantly, is it even possible to live without bad faith? Or is it necessary? A way to stay sane under the weight of total freedom. Sartre believed humans are pure freedom. We aren't born with a fixed essence, destiny, or true self. We define ourselves through our choices, every day, every moment. But that kind of freedom is heavy. It brings anxiety, fear, and the crushing responsibility of knowing that nothing and no one can decide for us. That's where bad faith comes in. To escape this pressure, we cling to ready-made roles and excuses. We say things like, "That's just who I am. I had no choice. It was the situation." The waiter who acts as if he is a waiter and nothing else. The woman who sees herself only through others' eyes. The man who claims he's just following orders. They're not hypocrites. They're scared of freedom. And so, they lie to themselves. But here's the tough question. Can we live without any self-deception at all? Sartre himself admits, probably not. Bad faith is everywhere. It even sneaks into our most sincere efforts to be authentic. Because it's easier to live in pre-made structures than to face the full burden of being undefined. Total lucidity, knowing you're free in every single moment, is psychologically overwhelming. It can isolate you, paralyze you, even push you toward despair. So yes, in many cases, living in some amount of bad faith may feel necessary for sanity, like a mental shield, protecting us from too much responsibility at once. A way to keep daily life going without constant existential collapse. But Sartre doesn't endorse bad faith. He exposes it. His goal is still authenticity, living while accepting as much as possible the truth of your freedom, to see the masks, to notice the lies, and to try, imperfectly, to live consciously anyway. Bad faith might offer relief, but it also keeps you from who you could be. So yes, living in bad faith may ease the weight of freedom, but it's the price of avoidance, not sanity. For Sartre, true existential health comes from the courage to face your freedom and to keep going even when it hurts. For Martin Heidegger, thinking about human existence goes far beyond what we do or feel. It means diving into the most intimate and silent experience of all, the awareness that we're going to die. In Being and Time, Heidegger develops one of the deepest ideas in existential philosophy, that human beings are, at their core, being toward death, sein zum Tod. But what does that really mean? And more importantly, is living as being toward death the only way to be truly authentic? Heidegger introduces the concept of Dasein, the being that we are, the one who is aware of its own existence. Most of the time, Dasein lives inauthentically. We go through life as if we were immortal, distracted, absorbed in routines and expectations that keep us from facing our own finitude. We live in what they say, what they do, a kind of impersonal existence. Death, however, shatters this illusion. Not because it's just something that happens in the future, but because it's always present as a real possibility. Death is the only absolute certainty, and it's entirely personal. No one can die in my place. Only I can face my own death. That awareness forces Dasein to confront its deepest freedom. When we understand that death is always near, we are pulled out of surface-level living and into the urgency of the present. Living as being toward death means recognizing that time is limited, and every decision matters. That's why Heidegger says only in facing death can we live authentically. Not because we should obsess over it, but because it reveals who we really are, a project moving toward an end. Death reveals the truth of existence, that nothing is guaranteed, time moves forward, and meaning isn't handed to us. We have to create it. So being toward death isn't morbid, it's clarity. It means accepting our finiteness as the very thing that gives life its weight. Every word, every gesture, every choice matters, because time is running out. That's where authenticity begins. The authentic person doesn't run from death or from the freedom that death reveals. Living authentically means living for what truly matters, and that only becomes clear when we face the limits of our time. So yes, for Heidegger, being toward death is the only way to be fully true to yourself. Because only when we accept death as part of life can we stop living by other people's expectations and start living from within. Death isn't the end of meaning, it's what makes authenticity possible. Conventional morality, the kind we inherit from society, religion, and tradition, often presents itself as natural, universal, and necessary. But both Jean-Paul Sartre and Friedrich Nietzsche challenge that idea. For them, living authentically, that is, living in line with who we truly are, often means stepping outside of traditional moral systems. So the question is, does being authentic require rejecting conventional morality? For Sartre, in Being and Nothingness and Existentialism, is a humanism. Human beings are pure freedom. We aren't born with a fixed essence. We build ourselves through our choices. That means there's no objective morality out there telling us who we should be. Conventional morality tries to box us in. The good citizen, the perfect mother, the respectable man. But by living through those roles, we fall into bad faith, lying to ourselves, pretending we are what others expect us to be. For Sartre, authenticity means owning our radical freedom, creating our own values, even if they go against the grain. It doesn't mean living without ethics, but it does mean rejecting inherited ethics we haven't chosen for ourselves. So yes, authenticity often requires stepping away from conventional morality. Nietzsche takes it even further. In Beyond Good and Evil and the Genealogy of Morals, he argues that dominant morality, especially Christian morality, was built on resentment. It flipped the values of life upside down. Strength became sin, joy became guilt, independence became selfishness. For Nietzsche, that morality is how the weak tamed the strong. It suppresses instinct, creativity, and vitality. In that sense, being authentic is a kind of rebellion. It means saying no to herd morality and creating your own values. Nietzsche calls this process a revaluation of all values, where the higher individual, the Übermensch, breaks free from moral traditions and becomes a lawgiver to themselves. But this doesn't come without struggle. The authentic person is always, in some way, an outsider to moralists. So both Sartre and Nietzsche agree. Authenticity requires a confrontation with common morality. Not necessarily a total rejection, but a deep questioning. We must ask, are these values truly mine, or just habits I've been trained to follow? But rejecting conventional morality doesn't mean rejecting all ethics. Both thinkers insist, if you create your own values, you also carry full responsibility for them. Freedom doesn't come with excuses, so yes, authenticity often demands rejecting conventional morality, not out of shallow rebellion, but out of a commitment to inner truth. Because only when we stop living by other people's rules can we truly begin to live. In The Gay Science, Friedrich Nietzsche delivers one of the most powerful and misunderstood statements in philosophy: God is dead. This isn't a shallow provocation, it's a serious diagnosis of a cultural and spiritual crisis. And it leads to a big question. Is rejecting God an act of courage or of despair? For Nietzsche, the death of God doesn't mean some divine being ceased to exist. It means that belief in a universal truth, an eternal foundation, a higher meaning, has collapsed. For centuries, Western culture relied on religious values to define morality, truth, and justice. But with the rise of science, critical thinking, and secularism, that foundation began to crumble. The result? A world with no transcendent certainty. But Nietzsche doesn't celebrate this with joy. In fact, he shows the deep fear it brings. The madman who announces God's death isn't laughing, he's terrified. He asks, where are we going now? Are we not falling? Without a center, everything becomes uncertain. What was once solid, good, evil, the meaning of life, begins to dissolve. And this is where the answer becomes complicated. Rejecting God can definitely be an act of despair. When the world loses its divine structure, many fall into nihilism, believing nothing matters. Nietzsche calls this passive nihilism, a surrender, a quiet emptiness, a retreat from life. But Nietzsche also offers another path, the path of courage. The death of God can be a moment of spiritual maturity, a chance to claim our freedom. This is when humans stop being children of morality and become creators of their own values. That's the Übermensch, the one who doesn't need divine guarantees to live with purpose. For Nietzsche, the real challenge isn't killing God. It's living afterward. It takes strength to not replace God with new idols, to bear the weight of radical freedom. So yes, rejecting God can be despair when it paralyzes us, but it can also be courage when it opens the door to new creation. Courage to live without metaphysical crutches, to face reality with open eyes, to say yes to life with all its suffering and contradictions. Nietzsche doesn't give us a rulebook. He gives us a challenge. Are you strong enough to live without God and still say yes to life? Few philosophers have dived as deeply into the emptiness of existence as Emile Cioran. In books like A Short History of Decay and The Trouble with Being Born, he doesn't search for comfort, meaning, or salvation. On the contrary, his writing is an exercise in painful lucidity. For Cioran, to exist is, above all, a sentence, an involuntary experience without purpose and without escape. And that's where he introduces a haunting metaphor. Is existence a prison without guards? It's a powerful image. A prison suggests confinement, limitation, no way out. But unlike traditional prisons, this one has no guards, no judges, no warden. No one put us here, and no one's coming to let us out. We simply are. Thrown into the world without being asked, forced to live without a manual, condemned to consciousness and the passing of time. Cioran writes, "We are born without having asked. We live out of habit, and we die unwillingly." This trilogy, involuntary birth, absurd life, and inevitable death, defines what he sees as the prison of existence. And the cruelest part is that there's no one to blame. God, if he ever existed, is dead. The universe is indifferent. Nature is blind. We are prisoners, not of a building, but of being itself. This absence of guards isn't freeing. It's devastating, because it robs us of someone to rebel against. There's no punishment, but there's also no meaning. Life presents itself as a burden without an author, a play with no plot. And in many ways, that's even worse than visible oppression. Cioran knew that the deepest existential despair doesn't come from pain, but from lack of direction. And yet, there's a paradox. Cioran didn't take his own life. That says something. Even though he saw existence as a mistake, he chose to live it out and to write from within the abyss. His philosophy becomes a kind of silent resistance. Not acceptance, but bitter coexistence with the absurd. He turns lucidity into style and despair into irony. Writing was his way of not going mad. So yes, for Cioran, existence is a prison, but one without walls, without guards, without locks. It's the fact of being conscious that traps us. It's our thoughts that shackle us. And in that sense, freedom itself becomes a curse. We are free to suffer from our freedom. Still, there's something deeply human in this view, because by refusing false comforts, religious, philosophical, or moral, Cioran forces us to look at life with brutal honesty. And maybe, in that act alone, there's a kind of courage that goes beyond hope, a dignity born not from redemption, but from awareness. Existence, for Cioran, is a cell with no door, and yet some still sit down and write in the dark. Life is made of choices. From the smallest decisions to the ones that shape our entire future, we're constantly standing at a crossroads. But what often goes unnoticed is that every choice is also a kind of loss. When we pick one path, we leave countless others behind. For philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Søren Kierkegaard, this isn't just a psychological fact. It's the tragic structure of existence. Sartre, in Being and Nothingness, says that man is condemned to be free. This condemnation comes from the idea that there's no predefined human essence, no divine script to follow. We are free to choose who we want to be, but because of that, we're fully responsible for our choices. And for Sartre, choosing means creating values out of nothing, with no guarantees, no forgiveness. But this kind of freedom carries a heavy weight, anguish, because every time we choose, we define ourselves. And we also shut the door on all other possible versions of who we could have been. A choice is never just about saying yes. It's also 1,000 no's. Loving one person means not loving all the others. Choosing a career closes other doors. Time, once spent, can't be reclaimed. And there's no way to know if we made the right choice, because there's no absolute rule to define that. Kierkegaard, in works like Either Or and The Sickness Unto Death, dives even deeper into the tension of choosing. For him, human beings are always torn between the aesthetic and the ethical, between living for pleasure, freedom, and endless possibilities, or choosing a life of commitment, duty, and rooted meaning. But neither path offers complete peace. Choosing the ethical, for example, means giving up the aesthetic, and that's a real loss of lightness, of spontaneity, of all the lives we'll never live. Kierkegaard calls this the anxiety of possibility. We don't just fear making the wrong choice, we fear all the versions of ourselves that will never exist. And that's the tragedy of choosing. It defines us, but it also limits us. So, is living the same as always losing? According to Sartre and Kierkegaard, yes. But that's not a reason to give up. In fact, that sense of loss is the price of being truly authentic. Choosing hurts, but it's also what makes us who we are. Freedom is only real because it forces us to say no, because it demands commitment. Sartre would say, we should embrace that loss with full responsibility. Kierkegaard would suggest that only by choosing with faith, even without certainty, do we become our true selves. Both, in their own way, believe that the pain of choosing is the price we pay for conscious existence. In the end, maybe the question isn't how to avoid loss, but how to live well with the losses that come. Because only those who choose risk losing, and only those who lose know what truly matters. For Jean-Paul Sartre, freedom isn't a luxury or a privilege that comes and goes depending on the circumstances. It's the very foundation of our existence. In Being and Nothingness, he says that human beings are condemned to be free, meaning we have no choice but to choose. Even when we refuse to make a decision, that refusal is still a choice, and in making it, we're still expressing our freedom. But that kind of radical freedom raises a disturbing question. If we're free, does that mean we're also free to destroy freedom itself? Sartre's answer isn't simple, but it's deep. Yes, we are free to act against freedom, even our own. We can choose to submit to authoritarian ideologies, to rigid social roles, to beliefs that deny our individual agency. We can also choose to support systems that oppress others. In other words, we can use our freedom to reject freedom, both ours and everyone else's. But that doesn't mean we stop being free. Quite the opposite. Even the act of destroying freedom is, paradoxically, an expression of it. And that's what makes freedom so overwhelming. And at times, so dangerous. It doesn't come with any built-in moral safety net. Nothing stops us, except ourselves, from using it in destructive, selfish, or submissive ways. That's where Sartre introduces the idea of bad faith, a kind of existential self-deception. To avoid the anxiety of being truly free and responsible for who we are, we often pretend we aren't free. We say things like, I had no choice, or I was just following orders, or that's just the way the world works. But these are just excuses. Bad faith means using our freedom to deny our freedom. It's the move of someone who would rather have the comfort of obedience than the discomfort of autonomy. This way of thinking becomes so common, it turns cultural. Sartre saw totalitarian regimes and ideological fanaticism as examples of collective denial of freedom. There's a deep temptation to live like a cog in the machine, rather than as an author of your own life. To turn the world into a closed system where there are no more choices, just rules to follow. And that's the real danger. When enough people freely choose to destroy freedom, freedom itself truly becomes threatened. Still, Sartre isn't hopeless. He believed that freedom can't be erased, only betrayed. And every betrayal is, in itself, still a free act. freedom never truly dies. It gets buried, ignored, or distorted. But it can always be recovered, the moment someone chooses to face themselves honestly and live as a free being again. So yes, we are free to destroy freedom. But making that choice doesn't excuse us. It just shows how powerful and dangerous our freedom really is. To live authentically is to acknowledge that power and use it not to deny freedom, but to expand it in ourselves and in others. We live in society, and living together seems to require some shared rules, a basic code of conduct that allows for cooperation, respect, and fairness. But philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche and Jean-Paul Sartre challenge the origin and legitimacy of these rules. Both question the idea of a universal morality and argue that values should be created by the individual through their own freedom. This raises a provocative question. If we create our own values, are we breaking away from ethical living? Nietzsche, especially in On the Genealogy of Morality and Beyond Good and Evil, argues that the dominant moral values in the West, like humility, obedience, and selflessness, come from resentment. They were created by the powerless as a way to control the powerful. Traditional morality, to him, denies life, represses our instincts, and brings everyone down to the same level. That's why Nietzsche calls for a revaluation of all values. The higher individual, the Übermensch or Overman, must break away from common morality and create their own values based on strength, life affirmation, and uniqueness. This isn't a call for chaos or cruelty. It's a path to overcoming mediocrity and elevating human existence. Jean-Paul Sartre, on the other hand, starts from the idea of radical freedom. In Existentialism is a Humanism, he writes that human beings are condemned to be free. There is no fixed human nature, no God handing down rules of right and wrong. Each person is responsible for creating their own values, but that freedom comes with a deep ethical responsibility. When you make a choice for yourself, you're also saying what you believe any human being should choose in your place. That means creating personal values isn't a license to be selfish. It's a call to responsibility. Sartre says that every time we act, we're putting out a model of what we think humanity should be. So ethical living doesn't mean blindly following fixed rules. It means being open to others and recognizing their freedom too. In the end, both Nietzsche and Sartre argue that creating personal values isn't incompatible with ethics. It's incompatible with rigid, inherited, dogmatic morality. For them, ethics should be alive, personal, and rooted in real situations, not imposed from outside. Problems arise when values are followed blindly or used as tools for control. So, ethical living isn't about denying individuality. It's about embracing diversity. We can live ethically when we recognize in ourselves and in others the freedom to choose, make mistakes, and begin again. Creating your own values doesn't destroy ethics. It can actually renew it, because an ethic born from freedom and responsibility is more honest, more meaningful, and more human than any moral code handed down from above. For Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher often called the father of Christian existentialism, faith sits at the heart of the human struggle, but not as simple belief or blind acceptance of doctrine. For him, faith is a leap into the unknown, a deeply personal act filled with anxiety, paradox, and risk. That raises the question, does having faith mean giving up freedom? Is it a way of denying personal autonomy? Kierkegaard's answer is more nuanced than it seems. In works like Fear and Trembling and The Sickness unto Death, he describes faith not as an escape from freedom, but as its highest form. Still, it's a special kind of freedom, not the freedom of logic or control, but the freedom to embrace uncertainty and the absurd nature of existence. In Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard reflects on the biblical story of Abraham, who was told by God to sacrifice his son Isaac. Abraham's obedience puts him in direct conflict with universal ethics. From a moral standpoint, his act is absurd and unacceptable, yet he follows through. For Kierkegaard, this isn't blind submission. It's the expression of a radical kind of freedom, one that goes beyond reason and social norms. This is what he calls the leap of faith, a leap without guarantees or evidence, where the individual steps forward alone, trusting in something that can't be proven. That's why faith doesn't deny freedom. It actually demands more freedom than any other way of life. True faith is only possible when lived in the presence of doubt, despair, and the real possibility of loss. However, Kierkegaard also warns that what people often call faith can actually be a way of avoiding freedom. When faith becomes a comfort blanket, something that shields us from existential anxiety, it turns into bad faith. In those cases, yes, faith can become a denial of freedom. Not a brave leap, but a way of running from the responsibility of being human. What Kierkegaard criticizes is not genuine faith, but institutionalized, inherited, automatic faith, the kind that stops a person from facing the real weight of choice, fear, and nothingness. Real faith can only begin when someone fully recognizes their freedom and still chooses to believe, in spite of reason, in spite of doubt. So rather than being a prison, faith becomes the abyss where freedom shows its most radical face. Faith isn't the end of freedom, it's the courage to remain free in the face of paradox, to believe without seeing, to affirm meaning in a world that feels absurd. For Kierkegaard, then, faith doesn't deny freedom. It deepens it, but only when it's a personal, existential choice, not a passive agreement with pre-made systems that, in the end, are what truly enslave the soul. The search for meaning is one of the deepest marks of the human experience. We want to know why we're here, what we're supposed to do, and what life is worth when we know it will end. But for Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, that search inevitably brings us face to face with an uncomfortable truth. The universe is silent. It doesn't give us answers. The world, as Camus puts it, is absurd. And we are conscious beings desperately trying to find meaning in a cosmos that doesn't care. Sartre, in Being and Nothingness, argues that human beings are radically free. We don't have a fixed essence. We are what we choose to be. But that freedom comes with a burden. We are solely responsible for giving our lives meaning. There's no God, no human nature, no objective morality to guide us. And it's in this emptiness that many fall into what Sartre calls bad faith, the existential lie we tell ourselves to avoid the weight of freedom. Bad faith means pretending we're not free, that we don't have choices, that we're just the result of what society or our circumstances allow us to be. It's lying to ourselves so we don't have to deal with the anxiety of creating meaning from scratch. And strangely, this lie can give us a sense of stability. It makes life feel like it has a script or direction. But that feeling is an illusion, and according to Sartre, it keeps us from living authentically. Albert Camus, in The Myth of Sisyphus, takes a similar path but with a different tone. He says we live between our craving for meaning and the silence of the world. That clash creates the absurd. The problem isn't that life has no meaning, it's that life doesn't have the kind of meaning we want. And most people, unable to cope with that, create comforting lies. Religious, ideological, moral, anything that gives the illusion of purpose. But Camus rejects that escape. For him, the real philosophical act is to reject comfort and still choose to live. He calls this revolt, living as if life has meaning, even while knowing it doesn't have a final or absolute one. This isn't lying to ourselves. It's the courage to live inside the contradiction, like Sisyphus, who keeps pushing the boulder not because he hopes for a reward, but because he accepts his condition with no illusions. So Sartre and Camus agree on something essential. Lying to ourselves might make life easier, but it doesn't make it more honest. And if finding meaning means fooling ourselves, maybe what we really need isn't meaning in the traditional sense, but a personal commitment to clarity and truth. The answer, then, is no. We don't have to lie to ourselves to live a meaningful life. But we do have to accept that meaning isn't given to us. It has to be made, and making it takes courage, awareness, and above all, a deep loyalty to the truth, even when it hurts. In The Stranger, Albert Camus introduces one of the most puzzling characters in all of philosophical literature. Meursault, a man detached from conventional moral values, indifferent to the suffering of others, to his own death, and most of all, to the meaning of things. He kills a man seemingly without reason, doesn't cry at his mother's funeral, and remains unmoved during the trial that condemns him. All of this leads to a disturbing question. If life is absurd, as Camus claims, does that make crime morally neutral? To answer that, we need to understand what Camus means by absurd. The absurd comes from the clash between our deep human desire for meaning and the silence of the universe. The world gives us no answers, no clear purpose, no absolute morality. It's silent in the face of our most important questions. But Camus is clear. Absurdity doesn't mean anything goes. It doesn't erase morality. It shifts it. Meursault, the main character, isn't a villain, but he's not innocent either. He's someone who refuses to fake feelings he doesn't have. He lives in the moment without reflecting much on the future or the consequences of his actions. His indifference isn't cruelty. To Camus, it represents the absurd man. Someone who lives without comforting lies, without illusions, and without moral engagement. When Meursault kills the man, it happens almost by accident, pushed by the heat, the blinding sun, and existential boredom. The scene is deliberately written with no clear motive. And that's what unsettles the court more than the crime itself. He's not condemned just for what he did, but for not playing the expected moral role, not showing remorse, not crying for his mother, not pretending to be sorry. Camus doesn't justify the murder. He presents it in all its absurd rawness. Meursault's killing isn't backed by some grand metaphysical reason, but it's also not morally neutral. The lack of ultimate meaning doesn't erase responsibility. In fact, in a world without God, fate, or objective moral truths, we are the ones who must give meaning to our actions and take full responsibility for them. If life is absurd, crime is still crime, not because of some divine law, but because it violates another person's existence and freedom. And Camus, in other works like The Rebel, makes it clear, absurdity isn't a green light for moral nihilism. It's a call to build an ethical life on shaky, uncertain ground, using our freedom. So, no, the absurd does not make crime morally neutral. It just removes the traditional pillars of morality and forces us to face responsibility without any metaphysical backup. Far from diminishing the value of life, absurdity demands we see it clearly and be accountable for what we do with it. In the lecture that became the book Existentialism is a Humanism, Jean-Paul Sartre presents a bold idea: existence precedes essence. With this, he breaks away from centuries of philosophy that searched for a fixed, universal human nature, supposedly given by God or by reason. Instead, Sartre argues that human beings don't have a predetermined essence. We create who we are through our choices. This leads to a provocative question. If we're completely free to define ourselves, does the idea of human nature even make sense anymore? For Sartre, the answer is yes, at least if we understand human nature as a set of unchanging traits that define how we're supposed to be. Historically, that idea has been used to justify moral rules, social roles, and political systems. Man is naturally selfish. Women are naturally emotional. Humans were made to serve God, and so on. But Sartre flips that thinking. He says that human beings exist first, throw themselves into life, take action, and only after that do they build their identity. We're not born with a purpose, we create one. And that means we're completely responsible for who we become. Each of us is the author of our own life, with no metaphysical excuses, no nature to blame. For Sartre, freedom isn't just one trait among many. It's the core of what it means to be human. We're not just free to pick between options that already exist. We're free to shape our own version of what it means to be human. And that radical freedom clashes with the traditional idea of human nature. After all, How can there be a fixed essence if everyone creates their own? That doesn't mean anything goes or that life is total chaos. Sartre admits we live with limits, material, historical, social, but even within those limits, we always have the freedom to choose how we respond, how we act, and how we give meaning to our experiences. Even a prisoner, Sartre says, is free to decide how to face their imprisonment. This kind of freedom breaks down the traditional idea of human nature because it rejects the idea that there's one perfect model of how to be human. There's no true man we're all supposed to become. Instead, there are countless valid ways of being human, all of them shaped through action, choice, and engagement with the world. At the same time, this rejection of human nature is also a celebration of human dignity. By denying a fixed essence, Sartre gives us the power and the burden to shape ourselves. That's what he calls existentialist humanism. Not a worship of human nature, but a recognition that freedom is the foundation of our humanity. So yes, human freedom, as Sartre sees it, destroys the idea of an essential human nature. But in place of that old idea, he offers something more powerful: the chance to create, moment by moment, what it means to be human, with no guarantees, but with full responsibility. In The Rebel, Albert Camus moves away from passive nihilism to build an ethics of resistance. After diagnosing the absurd, the lack of meaning in the world, in the myth of Sisyphus, Camus takes things further. He asks how we should act in a world where God is dead and good is no longer guaranteed. It's in this search that he finds rebellion as a foundation for ethics, which leads to the central question: is rebellion actually more ethical than submission? For Camus, the answer is yes, but only if it's a clear-minded, human, and compassionate rebellion. Submission, when it means blind obedience to systems, ideologies, or absolute authorities, is a denial of human freedom and dignity. To submit to the absurd, accept injustice, or give up critical thinking is, in his view, a betrayal of what it means to be conscious and human. Rebellion, on the other hand, begins with a no, a boundary drawn in the face of what's unacceptable. The rebel is someone who, when faced with oppression, violence, or lies, says, "This is wrong." But that no isn't only about rejection, it's also a yes to life, to justice, to solidarity. Camus writes, "I rebel, therefore we exist." That means rebellion isn't just about asserting your own dignity, it's about recognizing the dignity of others too. Submission can often seem safe, comfortable, even moral, especially when it's tied to tradition, religion, or social order. But according to Camus, that comfort often hides complicity. Obeying an unjust system, staying silent in the face of oppression, or passively accepting the absurd, all of these are ways of walking away from ethical responsibility. Ethics, for Camus, isn't about following outside rules. It's about protecting what's human in the face of meaninglessness. Still, Camus also warns that rebellion can cross the line and become destructive. He criticizes political and ideological revolutions that, by trying to force a new absolute meaning, like totalitarian communism or fascism, ended up betraying the very values they claim to fight for. Rebellion stops being ethical when it kills in the name of an idea, when it sacrifices real people for abstract ideals. That's why true rebellion, for Camus, is thoughtful, grounded, and loyal to real life. It rejects both total despair and rigid dogma. It walks a narrow path between hopelessness and illusion, but it's the only path that keeps ethics alive in a world without foundations. So yes, rebellion is more ethical than submission, because it affirms human dignity in the face of the absurd. It doesn't offer salvation, but it demands responsibility. It doesn't chase after certainty, but it insists on justice. And most importantly, it doesn't destroy freedom, it defends it. In On the Genealogy of Morality, Friedrich Nietzsche doesn't just criticize moral values, He digs deep into where they actually come from. He argues that the morality we know today, based on humility, selflessness, and sacrifice, didn't come from some universal truth, but from historical conflicts, resentment, and power struggles. This leads to a powerful question. Can the act of creating values actually be a way to control others? Nietzsche's answer is a loud yes, and he takes it even further. He says that the dominant moral system in the Western world is the result of a value reversal carried out by those he calls the weak. In the early days of civilization, according to Nietzsche, values were defined by the strong, noble individuals who embraced life and power. Good was whatever reflected strength, courage, and vitality. The noble class would say, good is everything that's like us. But the weak, full of resentment over their lower status, flipped the script by creating a new moral system, the morality of the slaves. They reversed the meaning of values. Now good became the humble, the obedient, the suffering. And evil became what used to be admired, the powerful, the dominant, the bold. According to Nietzsche, this moral revolution wasn't about truth or justice. It was about revenge dressed up as virtue. So for Nietzsche, the creation of moral values is never neutral or innocent. It's political. It's a strategy for gaining control, not through brute force, but through emotional and cultural influence. Christian morality, in this view, became a tool to tame people, to make them obedient, guilty, and submissive. But Nietzsche isn't just talking about the past. His warning is still relevant today. Anytime someone says, this is the right thing to do, we need to ask, right for who, in what context, and for what purpose? Values aren't timeless truths. They're human inventions, often created to support systems of power. That's why Nietzsche isn't promoting moral chaos. He's calling for something much more powerful, the courage to create new values that affirm life, express personal strength, and come from within. But these new values can only emerge once we stop blindly following the ones handed to us. So yes, creating values can definitely be a way to dominate others, especially when those values claim to be absolute, universal, or divinely true. Nietzsche's message is clear. Question where your values come from. Don't just accept them. Dare to invent your own. But here's the catch. For Nietzsche, value creation should never be used to control other people. It should be about lifting yourself up. The real ethical challenge isn't following pre-made rules. It's living with the strength to affirm your own existence, even if it goes against what the world expects. In the myth of Sisyphus, Albert Camus starts with what he calls the only truly serious philosophical question: suicide. If life is absurd, without any ultimate meaning, surrounded by death and the indifference of the universe, why keep living at all? This radical question isn't a sign of nihilism, but of existential clarity. Camus isn't looking for comfort, he's looking for honesty. And in the face of the absurd, he gives a bold answer. Living is an act of rebellion, and in a way, an act of irrational stubbornness. The central metaphor Camus uses is the Greek myth of Sisyphus, who is condemned by the gods to push a giant boulder up a mountain, only to watch it roll back down every time, for all eternity. From a rational point of view, this task is meaningless and unbearable. But Camus sees in Sisyphus a symbol of the modern human, struggling day after day, knowing there is no final meaning, yet still choosing to go on. Existence becomes a burden, not purely in a negative sense, but as something heavy, inescapable, and unexplained. We carry life the same way Sisyphus carries his stone, fully aware that it has no objective purpose, but still choosing not to give up. This choice, Camus argues, isn't rational in the traditional sense. Logic alone can't justify life in the face of absurdity. But that doesn't mean living is irrational in the sense of being delusional or blind. On the contrary, it's a lucid irrationality. It's knowing the universe doesn't answer, knowing there's no ultimate purpose, and still refusing suicide, still saying yes to life. That yes is what Camus calls revolt. Revolt isn't about hoping for salvation, but about standing with dignity in the face of absurdity. The absurd depends as much on man as on the world. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. This final line in the essay is the heart of his philosophy. We don't defeat the absurd by solving it, we live alongside it. And that coexistence is indeed a form of stubbornness, but a conscious, almost heroic one. Camus doesn't romanticize suffering, nor does he think we should just accept life passively. Quite the opposite. He acknowledges the pain, the meaninglessness, the weight of daily life, and still says yes to existence. That affirmation is aesthetic, ethical, and deeply existential. Life doesn't need a metaphysical reason to be worth living. It's enough just as it is. So yes, living may feel like a burden, but it's also an act of courage, and if it's an act of stubbornness, it's not irrational as in a retreat from truth, but irrational as in an act of resistance. Absurd life demands a commitment without promises, a determination without guarantees. To keep going, in Camus' view, is the most human gesture there is. In the end, to live is to be stubborn with clear eyes. And maybe, in that stubbornness, we find the only real kind of freedom. In The Gay Science, Friedrich Nietzsche delivers one of the most unsettling ideas in modern philosophy, with a mix of irony and seriousness. God is dead. With this metaphor, he's not just talking about the end of religious faith. He's announcing the collapse of all absolute foundations that, for centuries, gave meaning to morality, truth, and existence itself. And when those structures fall apart, what's left is nihilism. The realization that there's no ultimate meaning, no absolute values, no higher purpose. This raises a key question. Is nihilism the natural state of someone who is truly free? For Nietzsche, the answer isn't simple. It depends on some important distinctions. First, he sees nihilism as an unavoidable result of clarity. When a person becomes aware that there are no metaphysical guarantees, that all the values we lived by were created, not discovered, nihilism shows up like a void. It's the condition of someone who sees clearly, but hasn't yet learned how to create something new. In that sense, yes, nihilism is a natural part of becoming truly free. Because being free, for Nietzsche, means no longer relying on imposed truths, inherited beliefs, or divine rules. A free person is someone who thinks for themselves, who questions everything, who breaks away from illusions. But the cost of that freedom is an initial emptiness, the experience of losing all meaning. However, Nietzsche separates nihilism into two types, passive and active. Passive nihilism is what happens when someone gives up in the face of meaninglessness. It's marked by fatigue, resignation, and a longing for the old values that no longer hold. It's the state of someone who knows God is dead, but can't live without him. This type of nihilism paralyzes, weakens, and drains the will to live. It's a sign of decline in the human spirit. Active nihilism, on the other hand, is completely different. It's the awareness of the void, but instead of giving up, it triggers creative power. It's when the free person realizes, if nothing is given, then everything can be created. In that moment, nihilism becomes a stepping stone to something greater. The rise of the Übermensch, the overman, who creates new values, embraces life, and overcomes inherited moral decay. So yes, nihilism is a natural phase in the journey of the free human being. But it's not the end of the road. It's the necessary desert between tearing down the old gods and building new meanings. Nietzsche doesn't want us to stay in nihilism. He wants us to go through it. A truly free person, then, goes through nihilism like someone facing a trial. And by surviving it without running to false hopes, they gain the power to create, from themselves, for themselves. That's why nihilism isn't the death of freedom. It's a rite of passage. And only those brave enough to face it can truly live as free beings, without idols, but full of will. Hope is often seen as a virtue, a refuge from pain, a comfort in suffering, a light at the end of the tunnel. But for thinkers like Albert Camus and Émile Cioran, that view is, at best, naive. Both share a sharp, unsettling clarity. Life has no guaranteed meaning, the universe is indifferent, and suffering is unavoidable. So they ask, what if hope is just a refusal to face reality as it truly is? Or worse, is hope a form of metaphysical cowardice? For Camus, especially in the myth of Sisyphus, the absurd is the heart of the matter. The absurd is born from the clash between the human desire for meaning and the silence of the universe. There is no cosmic justice, no divine plan, no guaranteed redemption. In this view, hope becomes a dangerous temptation, a way to escape that truth. Camus writes, "Hope is one of the passions of the absurd. It's the worst of evils because it prolongs the torment of man." In other words, to hope is to delay awakening. Camus rejects both suicide and religious or ideological hope. Instead, he proposes lucid rebellion, living fully even while knowing life offers no promises. For him, real freedom begins when we stop clinging to illusions about the future and face the present with clear eyes. In that sense, hope is a kind of self-deception and therefore a form of intellectual and metaphysical cowardice. Émile Cioran, in books like A Short History of Decay and The Book of Delusions, takes this criticism even further. With a tone more poetic and pessimistic than Camus, he writes that hope is the worst poison disguised as a virtue. For him, the very act of hoping for justice, salvation, meaning, shows our inability to accept the fundamental failure built into existence. To hope is to refuse the void. It's a last breath of metaphysical cowardice before confronting nothingness. Cioran offers no comfort. He mocks hope as something that prevents us from embracing the full weight of radical freedom. Because despair, in his view, has a kind of quiet dignity. It's the moment when we let go of all spiritual crutches and face life with no illusions. From this perspective, hope becomes a childish response, a refusal to grow up in the face of the absurd. Still, it's important to note, neither Camus nor Cioran advocate for total despair. What they reject is the kind of hope that deceives, that numbs, that traps us in waiting. For Camus, revolt is a way of living without hope, but with intensity. For Cioran, even writing against hope is a poetic act of resistance. So yes, for Camus and Cioran, hope can be, and often is, a form of metaphysical cowardice. Not because hope is always wrong, but because it can serve as a subtle way to avoid the hard truth of existence, that there are no promises, only the present. In his famous existentialist phrase, "Man is condemned to be free," Jean-Paul Sartre reveals one of the deepest contradictions of the human condition. We are free, radically free, but we have no guarantees, no foundations, no pre-given meanings to tell us how to live. This leads to a provocative image. Are we like gods, but without any power? For Sartre, this condemnation to freedom is a paradox. The word condemned shows how heavy that freedom is. We weren't asked if we wanted to exist, and once we're thrown into the world, we can't escape responsibility for everything we do, or don't do. Existence comes first, and essence is something we build along the way. We are the authors of our own lives, but without a script, without rehearsal, and without an outside director. In this sense, we might be seen as gods without power. We are free to create values, give meaning to our actions, and decide who we want to be. But this creation happens in a silent world, one that doesn't offer us any built-in purpose or confirmation. Unlike the gods of mythology, we have no omniscience, no omnipotence, no absolute wisdom. All we have is our freedom, and the anxiety that comes with it. Sartre insists there is no human nature we're born with. We are what we make of ourselves, and that's a terrifying kind of power. There are no excuses, no destiny, no set essence. With every choice we make, we project an idea of what humanity should be. Each decision is not just personal, it carries a kind of universal weight. To choose for ourselves is, in a way, to say, this is how people should live. But this power has limits. We're surrounded by material, social, and historical realities, and by the freedom of others. The world pushes back. And in that clash between our limitless inner freedom and the hard limits of reality, we often feel powerless. We create meaning, but the universe doesn't respond. We take responsibility, but can't control the outcomes. We are free to love, but not to be loved in return. We invent values, but we can't control what they do. This is the tragedy of Sartre's idea of freedom. We're like gods in a void, with the burden of creating meaning, but no comfort of control. We are forced to invent good and evil, truth and purpose, all while knowing that it's built on nothing. Still, existentialist ethics isn't about giving up. Sartre doesn't preach nihilism, but radical responsibility. Since we are free, we have to act as if our actions matter. Not because some god or system guarantees them, but because we choose them. So yes, we are condemned to be gods without power. Creators in an indifferent world, free in a universe without direction, responsible even in the face of the absurd. And maybe that's exactly where human dignity lives, not in certainty, but in the brave act of choosing meaning, even when we have no power at all. If you made it this far, thank you so much. Reflecting on these ideas isn't always comfortable, but it's often in that discomfort that awareness wakes up and freedom starts to take shape. If this video made you think, or even challenged you in some way, give it a like, share it with someone who's also trying to understand life more deeply, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here, philosophy isn't just theory, it's a tool to live with more clarity. Drop a comment below. What part of this video hit you the hardest? What question would you ask the next philosopher? And of course, stick around. There's a lot more content like this waiting for you. See you in the next video.